welcome to the deep dive. If you're listening to this, there's a good chance you felt it. That quiet crisis inside. On the outside, everything looks fine, right? You've got the job, the success, the relationships are stable.
Everything is ticking along just as it's supposed to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But inside, there's this deep, unnerving emptiness. Or maybe you feel disconnected from things you used to love, or your whole belief system just collapses for no reason you can name.
It's a really unsettling modern paradox, isn't it? You achieve all the things you were told would make you happy.
Right.
And the internal feeling is just hollow. It's confusing. And honestly, for a lot of people, it's terrifying.
Absolutely. And I think the first and the most critical point we need to make here is that this feeling, this experience, it's not a sign that you're weak or that you failed.
No.
It isn't even necessarily a sign of a clinical illness. It's actually a pretty well-known psychological and spiritual phenomenon. It's called the dark night of the soul.
And our mission for this deep dive is to really get into that, to understand this inner turmoil, not as some pathology, not as something broken that needs to be fixed right away, but as a critical and, yes, sometimes an excruciatingly painful stage of profound spiritual and identity transformation. The sources are really clear on this. This kind of cleansing process isn't optional for real growth. It's required.
Okay, so let's unpack that journey then, because that term, dark night of the soul, it has some really deep roots. It goes back hundreds of years to Christian mystics.
It does. I mean, historically, you have figures like St. John of the Cross back in the 16th century. He defined the dark night as a phase of, and this is his term, passive purification.
Passive purification, what does that mean?
It's a crisis of faith, essentially. It's meant to burn away all the external comforts, all the ego-based attachments, all the stuff you thought connected you to God or to a sense of meaning.
It's the stripping away.
A total stripping away. And the whole point is that it's supposed to lead to this incredible spiritual growth. It's seen as the final stage of what they called unselfing.
But, most people today don't really operate in that specific religious framework. So when we experience this void in the modern world, what's the language we use for it now?
That's where it really overlaps with what we now call the existential crisis.
Oh, okay.
It's that same deep, fundamental questioning of life's purpose, of its meaning. And the reason it hits so hard is often because we're suddenly, maybe without even realizing it, confronting what some philosophers call the unavoidable existential givens of being human.
Right, and confronting our own mortality, our own death is a huge part of that. But what are the other givens that can trigger this kind of internal collapse?
Right, so there are four big ones. The reality of death is the first, just accepting our own mortality. But then there's the burden of freedom and responsibility.
The burden of freedom.
Yeah, the realization that you are fundamentally free to choose your life means you are also 100% responsible for the outcomes. And that weight, it can just crush an unprepared ego.
I can see that.
The third is isolation. The fact that, deep down, we arrive in this world alone and we leave it alone.
And that's that feeling, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of being intensely isolated even when you're surrounded by loved ones. That hits right on that point.
Exactly. It cuts right through. And the fourth is meaninglessness. This idea that if there isn't some pre-packaged, divinely given meaning to life,
then you would have to build it yourself.
You have to build it yourself. And that transition from just assuming meaning exists to realizing it's on you, that's the shockwave that kicks off the whole crisis.
So your whole internal world shatters because you're forced to face these massive, terrifying truths. Which brings us to the third phase of this transformation you mentioned. Identity dissolution. Ego death. It's defined as the complete loss of subjective self-identity.
Which, just on paper, sounds absolutely terrifying. The death of the ego, people hear that and they think it's a full mental breakdown.
But hang on, if ego death means the complete loss of self-identity, how does anyone keep functioning? I mean, why is this destruction necessary? Why isn't it just debilitating?
That is the crucial distinction, and we have to frame this in a positive way. This is not the death of you.
Okay.
It's the necessary death of the fabricated, the inauthentic self. The ego, in this context, is that old identity built on outdated rules, on fear, on survival mechanisms from your childhood.
So it has to go.
It has to dissolve to allow your authentic self to finally emerge. Think of it like a forest fire. It looks like pure destruction, but it's clearing out all the dead wood, and that allows for new, much stronger growth to come through from underneath.
That's a great analogy.
It's the necessary destruction that prepares the ground for something new and, more importantly, something true.
You know, that idea of the crucible, of this intense heat that purifies something, it comes up again and again in the source material.
It does.
And people who get through this painful process, they often say they would never want to go back to being the person they were before. They see that the suffering was the price they had to pay to shed that old fear-based identity.
Which confirms that the process is truly salutary, it's beneficial. Those dark moments, as some philosophers point out, they leave behind this trail that creates deep insight, profound self-awareness and real compassion for others.
Okay, so we've defined the different phases of this thing. But how do you know if you're actually in this transformative crucible versus just, going through a really terrible but normal period of sadness? Let's walk through the common internal symptoms.
Right. The symptoms are less about just a low mood and more about a profound sense of disorientation. So first, there's that deep feeling of emptiness we started with.
The void.
Yes. And second, the things that used to define you, the things that brought you fulfillment, your career, your hobbies, even in some relationships, they just stop working.
They feel meaningless.
Totally meaningless, like distractions.
And then you start questioning absolutely everything, not just your job, but your politics, your purpose, why you even live where you live.
Yes, questioning everything. And you feel so intensely isolated, even with people who love you, because the real problem is that your old belief system, the very foundation of your world, is collapsing.
And a new one hasn't been built yet.
Exactly. You're in this terrifying in-between space, and it often shows up as this pervasive, really unsettling feeling of just not being my former self. The old you just doesn't fit anymore.
And sometimes this whole destabilization can feel really weird perceptually, right? Like feeling detached from your own body or from reality.
Yes, and that brings us to depersonalization and dissociation. These are usually temporary symptoms that can happen during a really severe spiritual transition, what one psychologist called a spiritual emergency.
So what's the difference?
Depersonalization is that feeling of being an outside observer of your own thoughts or your own body. Dissociation is feeling detached from external reality itself.
Can you give us an analogy for why that happens during this kind of growth?
Sure. Think of your ego, your stable sense of self, as the anchor of a big ship.
Okay.
When you enter a dark night, the currents of this transformation are so powerful that they literally yank that anchor right off the seabed. You feel unmoored. You feel like you're drifting, detached, because that stable reference point you always relied on is suddenly gone. It's been dissolved too quickly by the heat of the process.
So that feeling of detachment is a side effect.
In this spiritual context, yes, it's often a temporary side effect of the ego being dismantled. If the person gets the right support, that feeling is actually a prelude to finding a much broader, more integrated sense of self later on.
That distinction between a side effect of growth and a chronic disorder, that brings us to a really critical challenge, especially for clinicians. Is this a salutary religious depression, as some call it, or is it a genuine clinical illness like major depression?
This is where Western medicine, which tends to favor a purely biogenetic model, can risk pathologizing a totally natural human process.
So we need some really clear ways to tell them apart.
We do. And in a dark night of the soul, two key things are often maintained, even with all the intense inner pain: function and hope.
Function and hope. How does that actually play out in someone's life?
Well, the person in a true dark night can usually still function. They can go to work, they can study, they can do their daily tasks, even if it all feels completely empty or robotic.
They're going through the motions.
Right. And crucially, they hold on to a clear wish to recover completely. There's a hope for a future, more integrated self. The suffering doesn't typically lead to self-destruction. In contrast, severe pathological depression often involves a total failure action, an inability to work, and a profound rejection of any possibility that things could ever get better.
The sources have this incredible historical example that just crystallizes this difference perfectly.
Oh, the story of Mother Teresa is it's profound. Her private letters, which came out after her death, revealed she experienced this staggering spiritual darkness for nearly 50 years.
50 years.
She wrote about feeling like God not being God, God not existing. That's half a century of extreme inner turmoil, the very definition of a DNS. And yet, she remained completely dedicated to serving the poorest of the poor.
So her inner state actually enhanced her actions. It didn't cause them to fail. She used that feeling of abandonment to connect with the people she was serving.
Exactly. That's the key difference. Her inner pain did not lead to a functional collapse. In fact, her colleagues talked about her serenity and joy. They had no idea what was going on inside. Her spiritual mentors saw it as a normal, non-pathological process that required meaning-making, not medication.
And this just highlights the danger of pathologizing the DNS. If you just slap a psychiatric diagnosis on this kind of profound suffering too quickly.
You risk treating a deep, meaning-based process with chemicals designed for a supposed brain disease. You ignore the very thing the person is desperately searching for, which is meaning.
And you tell them their experience is abnormal.
You do. You tell them their search for meaning is just a chemical imbalance, when in fact, this kind of existential suffering is a natural part of life. Healing requires putting that suffering into a wider human context, not just a chemical one.
Okay, so we've established that this is a painful but necessary descent. The obvious next question is, how do you walk through the fire? What's the plan for navigating this darkness?
I think the first rule of engagement is realizing that fighting it, resisting it, only makes it last longer.
Right.
Feelings that are accepted tend to resolve much faster. And the core strategy is to understand that the dark night is an inward descent. You cannot solve an internal problem with more external noise.
Do you have to actively turn down the volume of the outside world?
You have to. The focus has to shift from getting societal validation to finding personal meaning. You have to reduce the distractions, the mass entertainment, the superficial advice, the endless scrolling.
Embrace solitude.
Yes. Embrace solitude as a choice, as the space for contemplation. It's not isolation, it's a deliberate choice to be with yourself. You have to simplify your life, because this process takes an enormous amount of internal energy.
And this journey requires some serious internal heavy lifting.
Yeah.
Reframing the entire struggle. And this is where the work of someone like Viktor Frankl, with his idea of logotherapy, becomes such an essential tool.
Oh, absolutely. Frankl's work, which came out of the most extreme suffering imaginable in the concentration camps, is the perfect antidote to meaninglessness.
Right.
Logotherapy is all about the pursuit of meaning as our core motivation. And his whole point is that you can find meaning even in unavoidable suffering, as long as you can choose your attitude toward it.
So reframing the dark night, not as an empty void, but as a difficult path to deeper meaning, that's what builds resilience.
Unbreakable long-term resilience.
Yeah.
Yes.
And beyond just finding meaning, there's one last essential practice for coming out of this whole and integrated. And that's Jungian shadow work. So what exactly is the shadow, and why is dealing with it so critical during this time?
The shadow is essentially the disowned self. It's everything you see as inferior or evil or unacceptable about yourself that your conscious mind has pushed away, repressed.
Then you give an example.
Sure. If you identify really strongly as a good, kind, peace-loving person, then your capacity for justifiable anger, for confrontation, for even healthy selfishness, all of that gets pushed down into the shadow. Anything that doesn't fit the conscious identity you show the world gets buried.
So what happens to those parts you deny? They don't just vanish.
Not at all. They influence your behavior from the unconscious. They lead to anxiety, self-sabotage, that constant internal tension. And the real depth of the dark night is that it forces those repressed parts of the shadow up into the light.
So shadow work is about integrating that darkness, not trying to get rid of it.
Yeah.
How do you even start to integrate something you've spent your whole life running from?
Well, the core process is about courageously bringing that unconscious material into your awareness. A really powerful, actionable tip is to challenge that rigid, good person, bad person split in your mind.
How so?
If you identify strongly with a positive trait, like being super disciplined, its opposite, maybe laziness or spontaneity, is hiding in the shadow. If you're fiercely independent, your neediness is in the shadow.
So instead of fighting the neediness or the laziness, you have to acknowledge it, bring it into your definition of yourself.
Precisely. You have to accept that you can be both disciplined and have a capacity for chaos. You can be both independent and have a deep capacity for need. Integrating these opposites is what stops the internal war. It's what unlocks your full potential and moves you toward wholeness, which is the whole point of surviving the dark night.
This has been a huge and I think really challenging deep dive. So what's the core takeaway? The main synthesis for the person who is sitting in that emptiness right now.
The distress of the dark night, of the existential crisis, of ego dissolution. It's not random. It's not an accident. It's a crucible. The heat and the pressure, all that suffering, it's designed not to destroy you, but to burn away the impure, egoic self that was never really you to begin with.
So the strong, authentic self can emerge.
Clearer and more robust than ever before. The suffering has a function. It has a purpose.
So the goal isn't just to get back to the light, to get back to normal.
No, not at all. I think the final provocative thought is this. The goal is not the absence of darkness. It's learning to hold both suffering and joy at the same time. Just like Mother Teresa and others who navigated this, you can cultivate joy and purposeful action while acknowledging and enduring the deep inner darkness.
So it's about integration, not elimination.
Exactly. This willingness to go into your own depths. That's what connects you ultimately with the truth of all humanity. You're not alone in the dark. You're just finally integrating what it means to be fully human.